They good?
No, we have one more.
Okay.
And we do have something to bring up before the hearing.
Good. No, I'm not ignoring you all. That there's a facilities issue that needs to be addressed. I just sent a request on that. Ms. Clark-Palmer,
Yes.
what is we're back on the record after our morning break. What is it that we need to talk about?
With Dr. Rye will be coming up very shortly. He is our sleep expert.
Yes.
I have a video that I want to use with him. It is sort of a compilation of videos that he provided to me that show people other than Mr. McIver who have been recorded in sleep studies demonstrating movements, and those people have RBD, the REM behavior disorder. It's about a 2-minute video. I want to play that with him as part of his expert testimony. And I've provided the video to the state, and they have an objection to me using that video.
Okay. State.
Yes, Judge. The state has an objection. One, as to, I guess, relevance, because Mr. McIver, as Your Honor is aware, did a sleep study at Emory, in which the same thing was done that's being shown on video, where they were attempting to record any of the same actions that are depicted in what I guess I would describe as a demonstrative or the example video. So if Ms. Clark-Palmer, wants to show an example of RBD or REM behavior disorder, then I believe the most appropriate way to do that would be using the video that was done of the actual defendant. I'd also object as to one as the rule for the rule of completeness. That's not the entire video. From my understanding, it's a clip of, there's 26 clips in the video, and the ones that have been, for lack of better words, cherry-picked, show the most complex and, I guess, distinct characteristics of RBD. And I'd also bring to the court's attention is that they're from 1985, 1986, and things have changed from almost 30 years. So,
Meaning RBD affects people differently because of the passage of time?
no, the way that RBD, I guess, is treated and diagnosed, from my understanding, has changed over the years.
Okay, but the symptoms, if the symptoms are the same, which I would expect them to be even from 1,000 years ago, if this demonstrates the symptoms, I don't know that the fact that the video, I'm not disagreeing with some of your other grounds, but the fact that the video is from yesterday or from 20 years ago, I appreciate it's not of the defendant, but I don't know how the age of the video, unless you're saying it's going to be hard to see because it's so grainy.
Just throw in the kitchen sink, Your Honor.
Okay, all right. Are you handling Dr. Rye, Clark-Palmer? Okay. Do you expect his testimony to be that everyone afflicted with RBD, am I saying the right 3 letters?
Right.
Everyone afflicted with RBD necessarily has the same symptoms and manifests them in the same way? Or is it sort of akin, what I've been analogizing in my mind, folks will get experts on the stand, will say alcohol affects people in a different way. Some folks can have 10 drinks and they react X. Some folks can have 10 drinks and they're unconscious. I appreciate we're talking about a medical condition as opposed to drinking alcohol, but those experts, if they're being honest with the jury, will say, I can't tell you that alcohol affects this person a particular way because it affects everyone differently. Everyone grieves differently. Is RBD along those lines where there'd be some commonalities, but one person who suffers from RBD is constantly awaking with a trigger pull motion, whereas another one constantly awakes with a left-footed shot on goal.
I think that I expect the testimony would be there are commonalities to RBD, the whole body jerks, arm movements, leg movements. But because RBD is people acting out their dreams, no, they are not always going to punch or kick. And the same person may not always punch every time they're acting out their dreams. It depends on what they're dreaming. So I hope that answers the first part of your question. This is a demonstrative aid, and I think that everything Mr. Abadi outlined are things that are appropriate for cross-examination about the demonstrative aid, because he's right, it's not the video of Mr. McIver, and I think those are things that he can explore it will not be a representation that, this is how Mr. McIver acted on the evening of September 25th. It's just to illustrate for the jury and help Dr. Rye's testimony about, okay, when people have RBD, what are the symptoms that they exhibit?
What does it actually look
What
like?
does it look like? It's just like Dr. Sellers putting up the video or the piece of paper of the inside of the body and saying, well, here the organs are, here's where and relating it to, talking about Ms. McIver, like using the mannequin with Dr. Henniger that wasn't exactly
We heard a lot about that.
right, the same as Ms. McIver's build, yes, so.
Okay. So, Mr. Abate, if I distill it down to what I'm hearing from the defense, which is it's for demonstrative purposes, they will not be suggesting through Dr. Rye that what you see on the screen is necessarily what Mr. McIver does each and every time, but this expert would say this is an actual manifestation of RBD and the way in which folks can show that. How is it not an appropriate demonstrative aid?
I guess my response to that would be that in my opinion, it's misleading to the jury because they want to show how RBD affects the defendant, which is why we're here. Then I think the most appropriate way to do that would be to show how the symptoms of RBD are exhibited through the defendant. I think that was the point of doing the sleep study, at least that's what I thought was the point. Secondly, I would also say that there's a relevant objection on the state's behalf because Dr. Rye diagnoses or comes to the conclusion that the reason for the incident was confusional arousal, not RBD. So showing the symptoms or examples of how RBD affects some people, in my opinion, isn't relevant to his actual end finding, which, yes, he has RBD and he has a history of it, but the reason this happened on September 25th, it was because of a confusional arousal. So if you want to show examples of confusional arousal, I think that's relevant. But that's
the plot thickens. I've heard what Mr. Abate says. I know, one, nothing about sleep disorders, and two, I haven't seen the reports. Not necessary for me to see the reports. Respond to that last point.
Dr. Rye will link RBD and confusional arousals together and explain what the interaction is between the two.
So my thought is this. Conceptually, I don't see that there's a huge difference between playing that video as a demonstrative aid than Dr. Henniger using the mannequin as a demonstrative aid, because I think it would have been appropriate for Dr. Henniger to stand up and say, well, now look, here's the entrance and the exit, and I can move around. Do that with a mannequin. And in the same way, I think it would be appropriate for Dr. Rye to act out, well, you could do X when you're suffering from RBD. This is just a video representation of that. But I'm going to need you to tie it up first, and by that I simply mean connect confusional arousal with RBD, etc., before you lay the foundation for the video and tender it.
Okay.
And then we'll just revisit it. You can simply say you're renewing your previous objection, and I can say overruled or sustained after I've heard a little bit more from the expert.
Okay.
Were there other things we needed to talk about concerning Dr. Rye?
I don't think so.
Otherwise, you're good to go with Dr. Rye?
Yes, sir.
Great.
We got another nurse go first.
I was not told that he was the natural, so I figured we couldn't be done with Emory University Hospital. Yeah. Is the jury now ready?
They should be jury.
All right, let's find out.
All rise for the jury. All jurors are present and accounted for, Judge.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy. You all can be seated. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We don't have a hard stop for lunch today, so we'll sort of go with witness flow slash your needs for the next break. But the next break will be our lunch break, and we should be able to keep it to 45 minutes if that is your pleasure. With that, let's have the state call its next witness. You do the defense this time. I'm sorry, the defense, right? You know, after music, get into a rut. Defense, call your next witness.
Please raise your right hand.
No, not at all.
Who do we have up here?
Alison Neely, nurse from Emory Hospital.
All right.
Second appearance.
Yeah. Welcome back, Ms. Neely.
Thank you.
Do you swear and affirm that the testimony you should give the court today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Yes, ma'am. If you will, have a seat. Get as close to the mic as you can. For the purposes of the court's record, please state and spell your name.
My name is Allison Neely, Allison. Last name Neely, Neely.
And just so you remember, where do you work?
Yes, I work as an RN at Emory University Hospital on Clifton Road.
Okay. And were you there in September of 2016?
I was.
And were you at the ER?
Yes, I was.
Let's just go right to the audio, the video clip, which won't take any time this time. Why don't we look at the screen? This is State's Exhibit 217. Okay. Do you recall, did you see this in your direct examination last time?
I did.
Excellent. So you know exactly what we're looking at. Can you narrate a little bit?
At this particular time, Valet is pulling a wheelchair up to the SUV.
Okay. Tell us when we see you.
Okay.
To the right of the screen, Ms. McIver is now being put in the wheelchair.
That's me.
And that's you coming out?
Yes.
Okay. And that's Nurse Blair Brown coming out?
Correct.
Okay. And so where do you remain?
I'm behind the wheelchair.
Okay.
I'm the one that's pushing.
And into the door you go.
Yes.
Okay. And then we're going to switch to the view from inside the ER, looking towards those doors. There we are.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're coming in, correct?
Correct?
You're still pushing the wheelchair?
Yes, I am.
And I don't mean to be leading, but Mr. McIver was holding one leg and Blair Brown the other, correct?
Correct.
And where do you go? Now we're done with surveillance because there's no camera inside, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Say yes or no.
Yes.
Thank you. And where do you go?
From that particular view, we walk straight for about 5 feet and then we make a right. And on the left side is critical care room 2.
Okay. And do you go into the room?
Yes.
And do you remain behind the wheelchair between the view we just saw and getting into the front door of the room?
Yes, that is correct.
And did the other people, to your memory, remain where they were? Mr. McIver on the left leg and Nurse Blair Brown on the right leg?
Yes, correct.
And were there any changes in your locations between the 5 feet, 7 feet to the door?
No.
As you go into the room, is the door wide enough for 2 people on either side holding the 2 different legs and the wheelchair going into the room, or do you have to, is it too narrow to do that?
No, it's wide enough. It's wide enough.
So did all 3 of you go in with Ms. McIver in the wheelchair?
Yes.
Okay. When you're in the hall, as you're approaching the door, first of all, do you remember a nurse whose nickname is Shy? walking the opposite direction, walking past you and just going the other way?
I do not remember specifically seeing her.
As you were approaching the door and coming in, did you all stop for a minute or two and have a discussion, or boom, into the door you go? Which one?
What I remember is that we were moving. We went, because the door opens out, so we were going into the room. I do not remember whether or not we stopped. I know that normally when we're dealing with critical patients, we try to get them to the room as quickly as possible.
Is it fair to say then that you didn't stop and have a discussion out there in the hall?
No, I don't.
Did you at any time, from your vantage point from behind the wheelchair, hear Tex McIver say, "I shot my wife in the bathroom when I was cleaning my gun"?
No, I did not hear that.
It's your last question. My last question. Okay. Wasn't your own. Ms. Convery.
Ms. Neely, I just have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
The sort of environment surrounding that room that Mr. Samuel talked to you about, describe it for the jurors. What is it like that night when you are bringing Ms. McIver into the trauma room?
At that particular time, Blair had already radioed GSW, which is an acronym for gunshot wound. I do remember people moving in the hallway. I don't know exactly who. The only person that I know I specifically saw, because I purposely looked towards this person, was the charge nurse, and I looked that way because her desk was right in my view, and I looked that way to make sure she heard the call for critical care. You know, GSW. I made, you know.
Right, and is it fair to say that the charge nurse has a pretty important role as you guys are bringing somebody into the trauma room?
Yes.
And once you actually get inside the room, are there, in the few seconds after you enter the room, fair to say that the room gets pretty busy?
Yes.
Life-saving efforts going on inside.
Exactly.
As you're coming into the hospital after what we just saw on the video clip, what is your primary focus as you enter in that hospital room and eventually the trauma room?
My primary focus is Mrs. McIver. I was focused on transporting her and getting her into the critical care room so that we could start working on her.
You described to the jurors that Mr. McIver is actually holding Diane McIver's leg, or one of her legs. At any point, do you see him holding her hand?
No, I do not remember that, no.
After you come into the room and she's actually being placed onto the gurney itself inside the room, is he holding her hand then?
No.
At some point, do you notice the defendant actually leave back outside of the room?
Yes.
And do you notice where he goes after that?
No.
The next time you encounter the defendant is when?
The next time I encountered him, well, I didn't, the next time I saw him was in the waiting room. Once he was, well, actually he was in the triage room. I saw him in the triage room from the waiting room.
Okay. Outside trauma room 2, as you're standing sort of in the doorway of trauma room 2, you look to your left. What is over to your left in that area right there, immediately outside the room?
To the left,
Away from the entrance, where you would be looking for your charge nurse.
no. If I'm entering into the building and once I make that right, trauma room 2 is on the left. The charge nurse desk is straight ahead. The charge nurse desk is about where the third bench is from here.
Okay. And
Once,
the charge nurse desk, is fair to say there's a decent amount of activity going on around the charge nurse area?
sometimes there is, sometimes there is not.
And you said that she was important in sort of the context of bringing in a trauma patient that night. Why is that?
Because we want her to be aware of the type of patients that we're dealing with, and also she would be the one to call other nurses in for help or orchestrate care or call different departments to assist us in the care of the patient.
After Mr. Mr. McIver leaves the room and goes outside of trauma room 2, do you remain inside?
Yes,
And is your primary focus inside the room, giving care to Ms. McIver?
yes.
I don't have any other questions.
Any redirect?
Just one more.
They already
Redirect, they.
What is the charge nurse's name? It's a good question.
Nicole Baker-Smith. Nicole Smith Baker. She just got married, yeah.
Okay,
Nicole Smith
all right.
Baker.
I don't have any other questions.
I still have none.
Okay, didn't prompt anything. Jurors, any questions this time around for Nurse Neal? There are a few. Thank you, sir. Ms. Neely, if you or your team had been alerted that there was a potential gunshot wound victim waiting outside in the roundabout, is there a reason why you or your team didn't bring a gurney out?
Actually, we did not find out about her being shot until we were in motion in the wheelchair. The valet actually just said we need help, and they already brought the wheelchair out. So once I walked out, they were already moving her, and when you're dealing with a critical patient, time is of the essence, so you get the patient to where they need to be in the quickest amount of time. We were already moving when we learned that she had been shot.
Got it. Mr. Singh, any follow-up based on that question? Ms. Conlon?
Yeah.
Ms. Neely, thank you for coming back. Deja vu.
Are we done?
Great.
I'm just kidding. Is this the last
We're
one?
done for today.
All right, it was nice seeing you.
Next witness.
Dr. David,
Do you swear and affirm that the testimony you should give the court today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. If you will, please have a seat. Get as close to the mic as you can during your testimony. For the purposes of the court's record, please state and spell your name.
David Rye, D-A-V-I-D, R-Y-E as in bread.
Good morning, Dr. Rye. Where do you work?
Emory University.
What do you do there?
I am faculty and a clinician scientist that studies mechanisms of sleep in animals and humans.
What's your title?
Professor of neurology.
Okay. Do you have, so you're a medical doctor,
Yes.
all right? What's your educational background that enables you to be a medical doctor?
I graduated medical school from the University of Chicago it's a long time, 88, I think, and did an internship and residency in medicine and neurology in Chicago, and then became board certified.
Do you have a PhD?
I do as well as an MD.
What's your PhD in?
Neuroscience.
Okay. And when you you said you were an intern?
I was an intern in Chicago, yes.
Okay. And then were you a resident after you were an intern?
Yes.
All right. And what was your residency in?
My residency was in neurology, and I was chief resident at the University of Chicago my last year there in 91, 92.
What is neurology?
It's a study, a subspecialty of medicine looking at normal and abnormal function of the brain.
Has your medical career always been focused generally on neurology?
Generally, in terms of the structure and function of the brain and how it contributes to human behavior and animal behaviors with related to sleep and sleep medicine is my primary focus.
How long has sleep and sleep medicine been the primary focus of your practice?
Clinical practice since I came to Emory in 92. I mean, sleep medicine has evolved as a subspecialty. I think at that time there was maybe one fellowship program in the entire North American continent to something much more developed. And my thesis was that I did at the University of Chicago revolved around the structure and function of a part of the brain that controls dreaming and dream sleep. So it depends on where you make that cut. Actually applying it to humans would have been in '92, on a regular basis, but prior to that, my thesis work was also related to sleep.
Okay. And you said you were board certified or board licensed? How do you say that?
Board certified in neurology and then subsequently board certified in sleep medicine.
How long have you been board certified in neurology?
Since I think 1993.
How long have you been board certified in sleep medicine?
I believe 1994.
And just in a sentence or two, what do you have to do to become board certified in an area of medicine?
It's changed over time, but you essentially have to meet certain qualifications in terms of numbers of patients seen, encounters with patients with various different, neurologic or sleep medicine diseases, passed a written exam, and then at least in the case of neurology, used to be face-to-face evaluation of several patients with peers in the same room, sort of making sure that you were going about it properly. I don't think that that's a part of it now, an oral examination essentially.
Okay. And as part of your current duties, did you say already that you are, one of your titles and one of your current duties is as a professor at Emory?
Yes.
All right. And what do you do as a professor at Emory?
A little bit of a lot of things. I see patients up until recently in terms of encounters, either with relationship to patients or their sleep studies, approximately 40 to 45 a week. That's been cut back a little bit, but also laboratory-based research on basic mechanisms in animals. Also clinical science-related issues related to patients. Some administrative work that none of us can avoid, as well as some teaching.
There is a teaching component to what you do?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And before you were a professor, did you hold a different title that still had a teaching component to it in neurology?
Well, the natural progression is from assistant professor to associate professor to full professor, with or without tenure, and I'm at the end of that long chain. At various points in time, up until then, I was the medical director of the sleep laboratory at Emory, which I don't do any longer.
Are you on any committees that deal with neurology or sleep medicine?
Committees as in national or international. I've been deputy editor of the major journal in sleep, which is referred to as Sleep, and have recently stepped down from that. At one time I was the only sleep medicine specialist on the editorial board of the journal Neurology, which is the official flagship journal of the American Academy of Neurology, which I no longer do, and would review between 30 and 50 manuscripts from other people per year, and no longer do that.
So you mentioned two publications that you had some involvement with. Are there other publications where you were a part of the editorial board or had some sort of editorial function in the past or currently?
Yes, I can't list them all. I'm trying to decompress myself a little bit to focus on some more recent interests and pursuits in science.
Okay. In addition to acting in some sort of editorial capacity, have you ever published any written works on neurology or sleep medicine?
Quite a few.
Can you give us a number?
Over 100 maybe.
Okay. have you received any awards or honors related to your work in neurology or sleep medicine?
Yes.
Okay. Is it more than one or two? Would it be quite a list if I asked you to list them all out?
There's probably 3 or 4 major ones.
Okay, what are the major ones that you have received?
The Sleep Research Society, Scientific Discovery of the Year, also from the American Academy of Neurology for contributions related to some of the same work. Also been recognized by several patient foundations with respect to contributions made in terms of advancing patient care.
Do you hold any patents?
I have one patent that was recently approved in April.
What's the patent for?
It's for a novel treatment and mechanism to treat people who experience sleepiness or sleep for prolonged periods of time that are unique medicines from anything that's available or FDA approved at the moment.
And you mentioned that you also do research, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just kind of generally, can you tell us, when you say you do research, what do you mean? What is it that you do as part of your research?
Right now, the main focus is essentially related to this patent in developing a field around within sleep medicine to study patients who have not been benefiting from traditional approaches to treatments, FDA-approved treatments, in the broad realm of people with narcolepsy, people that sleep too much and can't stay awake. So our research is involved in recruiting such individuals, characterizing them very carefully. They often complain of cognitive difficulties, quote-unquote brain fog, along with sleeping too much. So a lot of it is patient-based, describing it, trying to characterize it, what we would refer to as phenotyping, characterizing the patients before and after treatments, doing some clinical trials, also looking at their spinal fluid and brain waves for biomarkers that are associate with the symptoms the patients are suffering from, so we can better target who these people are that might benefit, and also complementing that with animal models, mice, for example, with targeted gene abnormalities to understand the mechanisms, basic brain mechanisms that create this or emulate this in humans.
In addition to teaching at Emory, have you taught or lectured in any kind of capacity at other schools?
I have been sort of visiting professor at a few universities around the world, and also frequently a speaker at national conferences and grand rounds at different universities around the country and out of the country.
Can you give us some sense of how often you are invited to speak, either at a conference or another school, either a number of times that you've done it or maybe how many times a year you do it?
In the last 2 months, 3 times, including tomorrow morning.
Okay. So you told us that you have been studying neurology and sleep medicine since the early 90s?
Late 80s, early 90s.
Okay. Has your practice ever had any other focus in any other area of specialty outside of neurology and sleep medicine?
Well, I think to emphasize part of it is, sleep medicine is essentially an outpatient specialty. So you see patients in an outpatient setting, not necessarily in a hospital in an acute setting. For many years, given that I was a neurologist in the organization at Emory in terms of workload, I did was a neurologist in the hospital and emergency room, for example. So I've seen patients in the acute setting up until about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago when the sort of organization changed. So a lot of face-to-face interactions with people in hospitals, intensive care units, emergency rooms. In the practice of neurology, we don't usually see patients with acute sleep disorders in the inpatient service of the hospital.
Okay.
But many times they have sleep abnormalities.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I'd like to tender Dr. Rye as an expert in the fields of neurology and sleep medicine.
Mr. Abate, any desire to voir dire this witness or any objection to having Dr. Rye so qualified?
No desire, voir dire, no objection, Your Honor.
Okay. Dr. Rye, for the purposes of this proceeding, you are qualified as an expert in the fields of neurology and sleep medicine.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You may regret that. You are so qualified.
All right, Dr. Rye, before you came here today, did you prepare some slides to use as a demonstrative aid for your testimony here?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a copy of those with you, or do you need a copy?
I do not.
Okay.
Last time I saw them was on my computer as a PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. Can you just flip through those and let me know if those are the slides that you reviewed?
Yes, ma'am. It looks like all of them complete.
Okay. Your Honor, I would like to use, and I'll mark it later and tender it for purposes of the record, but I'd like to use this demonstrative aid, these slides of this witness, and I previously provided a copy to the state.
Would this end up being Defense Exhibit 17?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Abate, any objection to Defense 17 being used as a demonstrative aid?
Not at this time.
Okay. You may proceed.
Your Honor, I would say, and I've informed the state about this, the slides I'm going to present to the jury have the same content. The color and the design of the slide is different to make it more viewable on the screen, but the content's the same.
Okay.
So, Dr. Rye, I want to start by having you tell the jury sort of generally, what does sleep medicine look at? What do you study when you study sleep medicine?
I think it's important to realize that as a clinician practicing sleep medicine, the main issue is who accesses you. And again, as I commented on previously, usually in the clinic, in the outpatient clinic, and has a symptom that they relate or that their other physician has suggested to them relates to sleep or a problem with sleep. It is multidisciplinary. There are many facets and aspects to sleep medicine and how it affects different organ systems or interacts with different organ systems. Primarily my interest is in the brain.
Okay. And what are sleep disorders?
Medical disorders. This is now a medical subspecialty recognized by the American Board of Medical Subspecialties. And sleep disorders are sort of occur across different categories. They can be insomnia, the inability to sleep, disorders of breathing. I think we're all familiar with obstructive sleep apnea, or at least have heard of it. We hear about it on the radio all the time. Disorders of being sleepy or sleeping too much. Their prototypical disorder might be narcolepsy. There's a group of disorders referred to as parasomnias, which would be the acting out or elaboration of motor movement activity or behaviors within or during or from sleep. And there are sleep-related movement disorders, for example, restless leg syndrome, which I've studied extensively as well. So those are broad classification.
Can sleep disorders have an impact on a person's well-being while they are awake?
That is true.
Okay. What are some of the reasons why, what are some of the impacts that having a sleep disorder may have on somebody when they're awake?
They can experience sleepiness or have difficulties waking up first thing in the morning. They can have fatigue, and that can be either physical fatigue, mental fatigue. Fatigue's a difficult construct to get your head around. Excessive daytime sleepiness is a big one. Cognitive issues, focus, vigilance.
Okay. So tell us about how a doctor can become specialized in sleep disorders and become board certified in sleep medicine.
So recently, as I kind of referred to previously, the general area has sort of sought wider recognition as a subspecialty, and that has occurred in the last 10 years. And essentially, as I mentioned, there was only one fellowship program when I was entering the field. Now there are 40 or 50, and you essentially have to have training in a medical subspecialty, psychiatry, neurology, internal medicine, pulmonology, and become board certified in that specialty before doing additional work and clinical effort, and separately become board certified in sleep medicine. So you have a principal board, which is your subspecialty board, and then a sort of icing on the cake is your sleep medicine specialty.
Okay. Your principal board, if your principal board is not pulmonology, neurology, psychiatry, internal medicine, or the other one I can't pronounce that starts with
Otolaryngology.
If you don't have one of those primary boards, can you get board certified in sleep medicine currently?
Not currently.
Was it different at some point?
In the past, there were psychologists that were important in starting the field or initiating the field, as well as we actually had one of the few nurse practitioners here at Emory that was board certified in sleep medicine.
Okay. Is it fair to say that the field of sleep medicine is growing or changing in some way?
Well, it's taken off quite a bit while I've been involved in participating in it. I think it's getting a little, plateauish at the moment, but certainly it's grown quite a bit in the time I've been, from one fellowship program, for example, a specialty training program, from 1 up to 50, 60 within the United States.
Okay. So you told us already about some of the sleep disorders. Are the sleep disorders categorized in some way?
Yeah, so there's several additions, and I point out this is iterative as we learn more about sleep and disorders of sleep, and every so often there's now the 3rd edition of the International Classification of Sleep Disorders, which is one past the 2nd edition and the 1st edition, which has been around for about 15, 20 years. And you get task forces or consensus committees together to sort of look at new information that's been published or new experiences, and essentially try to codify or place different disorders into different classifications. Generally, there's different motivations behind doing that, and sometimes they're clear, sometimes not so clear, in terms of usability to the clinician, as opposed to having very strict definitions, for example, that would create homogeneous subgroups that would be ideal if you were doing, say, a clinical trial on a medicine. You don't want a lot of variability in those sorts of studies, so you adhere to very strict criteria, as opposed to sometimes just the theme of the taxonomy or categorization of the disorder gives it much more latitude. For example, the recent DSM-5 for psychiatric disorders, I think, is a great example of that, and it's been fairly controversial in terms of medicine and specialties looking at it, because it's more made for the clinician and less reliant upon objective findings.
All right, so let me ask you about one of the categories of sleep disorders specifically. Is parasomnia, is that a category of sleep disorder?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so tell us about what parasomnias are.
Will be unusual behavior within the context of sleep or arising from sleep, acting out. That could be ones I think that folks would be familiar with would be sleepwalking. Another, we can parse words about if you have seizures, epileptic seizures within your sleep, you could either sort of say specifically those are epileptic seizures, or they're a behavior that occurs within sleep. They're due to a specific issue, which is an epileptic focus in the brain. Sleep talking, acting out one's dreams, also known as REM sleep behavior disorder, is something that can happen where people are acting out.
Okay, and we'll come back
Moving.
to that one. And confusional arousals?
Confusional arousals also.
Okay. So if somebody comes to you and says, I'm having trouble sleeping well, what do you do to evaluate their sleep and maybe ultimately make a diagnosis?
Well, take a much more careful history. That's a very, vague, I'm having problems sleeping, but not unusual in clinic. What time of night does it happen? What things make it better? What things make it worse?
How do you do that? How do you take a detailed history?
Carefully.
Well, I mean, are you asking them to fill out a questionnaire? Is it an interview? How's that process done?
I tend to like to give patients questionnaires because that's constant to make sure we get the same sort of information from everybody, and then I have a frame of reference for comparison, comparing them to a larger pool, either statistically or just sort of to remind myself. But then taking a history, I think, is really critical. I think it's a lost specialty that neurology, I think, has a long tradition in, taking a good history, performing a physical exam, performing a neurological examination, which I think is unique and, again, starting to become a lost specialty.
Why do you take a physical exam? What are you looking for?
Physical exam, for example, if you're interested in patients that have an upper airway problem, large tongue, jowly neck, things that may make them, physical attributes that may make it more likely for the upper airway to collapse and cause sleep apnea. That's one example. Neurologically, I spend a lot more time on the neurological examination. People can have deficits or brain injuries that may have gone unnoticed, or certain characteristics that are otherwise subtle if you don't look for them, that are associated with various sleep disorders. So depending on what the complaint is, I might do a mini mental examination and do what the Montreal, cognitive assessment that we heard our recent president had when he was undergoing his exam, was all the buzz, right? MoCA. He's getting his MoCA. So you might do a MoCA, do blood pressures, examine the motor system, movement, dexterity of movement, coordination of movement, balance, extraocular eye movements, the visual systems, 2/3 of what our brain is designed to do, so that is oftentimes revealing. The sensations and your ability to sense various things in the periphery. So it's all an attempt to understand across the scope of the brain and the spinal cord and the peripheral nerves, is there an injury or some aspect that may be or may not be related to the patient's complaint with respect to sleep.
Do you watch the patient sleep in some way?
Once we get past the outpatient examination and evaluation, if we can, if it's indicated, we will order and perform what's called polysomnography, where the patients are brought into the sleep laboratory and different electrodes or sensing technology is put on various parts of their anatomy, not needles, just nice things, so don't get afraid. And record brainwave activity, eye movement activity, heart rate, pulse, oxygenation, how well you stay oxygenated, your breathing, your effort of your chest, movement of your chest and thorax and abdomen, also whether you have limb movements. And in many instances there's an infrared camera, so it's all videoed, so you can sort of associate what you see with behaviors or lack of behavior. That's the nighttime sleep test. If we can get those approved by insurance now, becoming much more difficult. And then oftentimes if the patient's complaint is around being sleepy during the day or having, disorders of concentration during the day, or it occurs within a unique setting, clinical setting, we may also keep them the next day and then allow them to take naps during the day and assess how nappable or sleepable the patient is, for sort of a lack of a better term.
All right, and in this particular case, did you do that kind of evaluation on Tex McIver?
Yes, ma'am.
When did you do that, just approximately?
January of this year.
Okay. And jumping ahead, did you ultimately diagnose with that Mr. McIver had some kind of
It's okay. It's, I guess, hard for you to get counsel from your team when we all get counsel. There's nothing wrong with filling in, not filling in, trying to help out, but the objection was leading. Do you want to rephrase it? Do you think it wasn't leading? I know you hadn't finished the question.
I can rephrase it. Did you ultimately make a diagnosis about Mr. McIver?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, what was your diagnosis?
REM sleep behavior disorder.
Okay. So let's talk about, and in making your diagnosis, did you give Mr. McIver the questionnaire?
Had him complete some questionnaires, yes.
Did you do any kind of physical examination?
I did a fairly extensive physical examination and neurological examination.
And did you do the polysomnography?
We completed polysomnography.
And also, did you do anything else, any other kind of?
We kept him the next day and did what's called a multiple sleep latency test to look at his sleepability.
Okay.
We also administered something referred to as a psychomotor vigilance task, which is not standard, which is essentially looking at his ability to, sort of like a reaction time test. You get a red light, you push a button. Not so much about the average and how fast you can do it, but more about the pattern of consistency in how you perform, rather than just an average performance.
Did you also review any of Mr. McIver's medical records?
I reviewed an extensive set of medical records from Executive Health from the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida.
Mm-hmm. And when you say extensive, how far from the medical records, what was Mr. McIver going to the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville for?
Typically Executive Health sort of examinations are just general primary care, evaluations on a yearly or biannual kind of basis to just look at general checkups and or specific complaints. And this was ongoing for about 10 years, I think, if I remember right.
Was there any reference in the medical records to complaints about sleeping problems?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Did the medical records that you reviewed show that Mr. McIver had previously undergone any sort of sleep study or sleep evaluation?
He had.
And how far back did the medical records show any kind of complaints about sleep, problems with sleep?
early 2000s, just after the millennium. I think his sleep study there was in 2004, if I remember correctly.
Okay. So, all right, will you tell the jury, explain to the jury what REM sleep behavior disorder is, and maybe start by explaining what normal sleep is?
So normal sleep is divided into various stages based on brain activity and other markers, physiological markers. It's broadly divided into what we call REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. If you wake people up from that, they essentially report dreaming. It's been known, essentially the correlate of dreaming. And then the other big chunk of sleep is referred to as non-rapid eye movement disorder sleep. Non-rapid eye movement disorder sleep is further subdivided into 3 different stages. Stage 1, which is, I guess you could call quote-unquote light sleep. Then there's stage 2 sleep, which has very specific characteristics, or now called N2 sleep. And then there is what's been referred to as quote-unquote deep sleep, which is stage N3 sleep. And each of these has various characteristics related to it that allow identification between, pretty decent agreement between, say, you and I, if we look at it in 2 different locations. Fingerprints that define these different states are, well accepted, and there's good inter-person agreement on how to identify these things.
And in normal sleep, how is the human body, how is it affected in normal sleep? Do you lay still? Do you roll around in normal sleep? What do you expect the body to do?
Well, generally speaking, the activity in the motor system decreases, and that's essentially almost a passive default mode where it decreases activity. When one gets into dream sleep, the body, then the brain specifically, has an active mechanism that ensures that we don't act out our dreams. So there's a part of the brain that becomes active, and it inhibits movement. And you would say, well, gosh, why don't I choke to death in dreaming each night? And that is because it only does your rib muscles and accessory muscles of breathing, but your diaphragm is saved from that paralysis, and it's what saves you. It allows us to breathe while we dream.
Okay. So I asked you about normal sleep. Now will you tell us a REM sleep behavior disorder, what is that?
So there's the observation, and then there's the mechanism. So the observation is that patients will act out their dreams. These are usually emotionally laden. Oftentimes there's some emotion, or that you're being chased, or there's some danger, and essentially you act out your dream. Oftentimes when people arouse from these, they don't arouse quickly and become conscious quickly. They frequently have amnesia for this. It's usually a bed partner that tells you that they're either from the talking or the types of movement, that the movement seems semi-purposeful, as if it was directed or within the context of the dream mentation. If the patient is woken up and asked specifically about it, if it is allowed to kind of go to its fruition, patients may oftentimes not recall, they can remember a dream, but they can't give you details about specifically what. More than half the patients can't really give you the details of the dream content.
Okay. And so when you say acting out the dreams, or maybe physically, how does that manifest in someone who has, is it paraphrased as, or referred to as RBD?
Yes.
Okay. So how would someone manifest a symptom of RBD?
Well, it's on a continuum. Often when we lecture the students, and I think people can maybe relate to the fact that if they have a pet dog, for example, you'll see the dog twitching in its sleep. That's sort of subclinical REM behavior disorder, but on a continuum, it can sort of escalate into full-blown movements and and they can be self-injurious, or they can be, induce injury to a bed partner.
And you were waving your arms, but that's not going to be captured by the court reporters. So can you, in words, kind of describe what somebody's limbs?
Well, they can hurt themselves. Their limbs can, move, off the bed. They can fall out of the bed. They can hurt themselves that way. I didn't bring any pictures of people, bed partners that have gotten black eyes, broken bones. We've had patients break bones and from this. From falling out of bed or slugging of bed rails. And there's a sort of a whole range. It's become sort of a interesting field to go at in terms of what the content of the dreams is. For example, there's an expert in the world in France who frequently at meetings will show pictures of videos of her patient who is a former soccer player for the French national team, kicking soccer balls in his sleep and sort of talking about scoring a goal and raising his arms up and cheering within his dreams.
Okay. If somebody has RBD, does that mean that every time they go to sleep that they will act out their dreams?
No.
Can you say somebody who has RBD, how often will they act out their dreams?
I don't know if that's been categorized anywhere in a large series of people.
Okay. And people who have RBD, do they all exhibit the same kind of movements during the night, or does it differ by individual?
Differs by individual, differs by the content of the dream. It can differ in terms of which muscles are involved and whether that's related to the dream content or something independent.
Okay.
Can't say.
All right. Is RBD and somebody acting out their dreams, is that associated with a particular part of the sleep cycle?
It specifically associates with rapid eye movement sleep or dream sleep.
Okay.
That's the name.
Okay.
REM behavior disorder. Right?
All right. And the way that humans sleep, does it change with age?
Yes.
How does it change?
Sleep in general becomes more fragmented. So we were talking before about just moving or rolling over or waking up for short periods of time within the night. Dream sleep tends to become less as we get older. Stage 3 sleep, which is deep sleep, can disappear in men, for example, at the age of 50 or 60, so you don't see it. It sort of persists longer in women. Deep sleep, stage N3 sleep. So there are changes over the life cycle. One of my colleagues at Emory is an expert on this.
So if you have less REM sleep as you get older, does that mean that someone with RBD, that the effects will lessen as they get older?
I don't think that's necessarily, necessarily follows.
Okay. If somebody comes to you and says, or they have a bed partner who's complaining that they're jerking their arms or legs, and you put them through the polysomnography where you are watching them sleep. If you don't see any evidence of them jerking their arms or legs, how does that impact a diagnosis of RBD?
Not much.
Why do you say that?
Well, human behavior is complex. Behaviors don't occur in any predictable fashion on a night-to-night basis or within a night basis necessarily. So a lot of what people do for this disorder or other disorders of sleep that I kind of intimated before was try to find surrogate proxy, a proxy marker, a biomarker, some other marker that's specific to the clinical complaint and disorder of the patient that allows you with greater sensitivity and specificity to render a diagnosis if you just don't happen to capture that Kodak moment in your sleep laboratory.
So, in this case, you told us that Mr. McIver underwent the polysomnography, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So you have a video of him sleeping in your lab, correct?
Yep, yes.
Okay. Let me back up and ask, can where someone is falling asleep and their familiarity with that area, can that impact their sleep? Can that impact their sleep?
It can in some people. There's a factor known as the first night sleep lab effect, for example.
What is that?
If you're doing you're in an unfamiliar environment, you don't know the bed, somebody's watching you, you know, all this sort of non-usual, habitual environment for sleeping, you know, can generally associated with more problems falling asleep, more likelihood of waking up for short little periods during the sleep period. So when people do clinical trials of medications, for example, they'll frequently do 2 nights in a row and throw the first night out, essentially, and that's sort of the first night effect, because they don't want that. That's not necessarily clean.
Okay. And how many nights did you study Mr. McIver in the lab?
1 night.
Okay. So do you have a video of him asleep in the lab?
Not with me.
No, but was one made?
Yes, ma'am.
And did you review that video?
Yes.
Okay. And in that video, did you see Mr. McIver jerking his arms or legs?
Not that I was convinced was related to a dream content.
Okay. So why is your opinion that he has RBD if you didn't see it on the video from the sleep lab?
Well, there's 2 reasons. Well, 3. One, you still have to exercise clinical judgment, and that relates to how good is the history. Is it either from the patient or from someone else? Number 2 is he did have a previous study that was done at Mayo Clinic Jacksonville in 2004, which did specifically comment about his moving his arms and legs in a sort of large amplitude movements while he was dreaming in the sleep lab in Jacksonville. So that's 2. 3 is because we've actually studied this, my colleagues and I, at Emory. We have come up, and other people as well have recognized that. It hasn't sort of made it into criteria at the moment, but it's headed that direction, is that there are proxy measures that are very highly sensitive and specific for REM behavior disorder. So the little twitching I was referring to before that doesn't really become an overt behavior that's visible by video, little tiny twitches of the muscle, we can distinguish patients with that we have studied with idiopathic REM behavior disorder versus age-matched controls, and it's very good at discriminating them. And there's a reason to do that, but you didn't ask me that question.
We'll come back to that.
Don't worry, I promise you will come.
Yeah, we will come back to that. Did you finish your answer?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. So I want to ask you about the age-matched biomarkers.
Mm-hmm.
Let's break that down just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So you told us before that part of the polysomnography is hooking up electrodes to somebody's various points of their body.
Yes.
Right? Okay. So did you put any electrodes on Mr. McIver's arms, hands, legs, his extremities?
Yeah, traditionally the sleep laboratory will only put them on your shin, what the muscle is called the anterior tibialis muscle. But we've through our research and others that we've been involved with and others in the world have realized that what muscle you pick can be very important in terms of how good it is at picking up abnormal activity. So for humans, it's been determined that distal flexor muscles, these are the things we use a lot, and maybe around the mouth, are the most sensitive to pick up any kind of exaggerated activity. And it's very species dependent because we've studied mice, and lo and behold, the most sensitive is the little vibrissae underneath their underneath their base pads, because that's what they use mostly during the day.
So with Mr. McIver, did you put electrodes?
We added electrodes on his arms because that was, we wanted to pick up as much as we could, and also one right here, which is traditionally used in standard studies, is the mentalis muscle, so under here.
Okay. And is there data that you have that tells you, for somebody in Mr. McIver's same age group, the amount of muscle movement you would expect to see on the arms and kind of chin area?
Yes, there is.
Okay. And how did Mr. McIver's data that you recorded that night in the sleep lab, how did it compare to what the standard or normal type of movement is?
Elevated in all channels,
All right.
particularly the chin.
Okay. And so what does that indicate to you?
Well, I mean, given what's been studied for young normals, disease normals, Parkinson's disease, aged matched controls, it's elevated. It suggests that it's consistent with this being, and compared to other people that have the same complaint of idiopathic REM behavior disorder, it supports that diagnosis.
Okay.
In the absence of overt behavior being captured in the sleep laboratory, which we don't always see.
All right. And you talked about the history, that the history was part of your diagnosis in this case, right?
Yes.
And that was looking back at the Mayo Clinic records, right?
Yes.
Okay. And in those records, was there any documentation about Mr. McIver's bed partner complaining about?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. What was in there?
Your Honor, here's that.
He's an expert witness who's allowed to rely on documents that may not be otherwise admissible.
He can base his opinion on that and describe the types of documents, but I don't know that that is a vehicle to get in the content of those documents. And I heard your question, I may have misheard it. You say, tell us what was in this document you were reading, as opposed to, I reviewed it and based on that I conclude X.
Okay, I'll ask a different question. Would you qualify the history in the Mayo records as being a good history, a detailed history, with regards to Mr. McIver's sleep complaints?
I don't want to have to comment about and make negative comments about the Mayo Clinic.
Okay, well, you saw,
Necessarily.
part of your diagnosis was based on what you saw in the Mayo Clinic records, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And was there, in the Mayo Clinic records, was there a consistent, was there any consistency in the complaints about the quality of Mr. McIver's sleep?
I think what impressed me most, spending about an hour and a half speaking with him and comparing that later when I looked at the Mayo notes, was over that period of time how consistent the descriptions, contents of some of the dreams were. I mean, they were remarkable. I mean, my patients can't remember stuff for 2-3 years. To be that consistent, I was a little surprised by it.
Okay. When Mr. McIver was in your lab for the nighttime sleep observation, how quickly was he able to fall asleep that evening?
2 minutes.
And is that normal or unusual?
I think it's fast.
Okay. Why do you say that?
Having done thousands and tens of thousands of sleep studies over 25 years, anybody falling asleep in less than 5 minutes is, unless they have narcolepsy or something, they're extremely sleep deprived or have something else going on, is not very typical.
Okay.
Some people there's occasionally people fall asleep in 30 seconds, but 2 minutes for any of us is pretty quick to fall asleep in a strange environment.
Okay. And then in the multiple sleep latency test, that's the one that looks at napping during the day, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And how does that work? How many opportunities?
So we do, to increase the chance or likelihood of getting a better sample, we do that 5 times at 2-hour intervals. So you might we might wake you up at 7:30 in the morning, and then at 9 o'clock the lights are turned off, you're in the bed and you're asked to please rest and try to go to sleep. And you have basically 20 minutes to fall asleep. If you fall asleep, you're allowed to sleep for 15 minutes. You're woken up, wait 2 hours, you do it again. So you do that 5 times and you can come up with an average. And there are norms that are published for that. It's traditionally a test used to diagnose a disorder called narcolepsy,
Okay.
which wasn't really on my mind, but
Was Mr. McIver able to fall asleep during any of those napping
he
opportunities?
fell asleep on 2 of the 5 nap opportunities.
And in one of those, well, how quickly did he fall asleep when he fell asleep?
And I think on average, I'd have to refer to the report that's in front of me if I can do that.
You can do that, just tell us what you're going to look at to refresh.
This is just the report that was generated from his sleep study at Emory University that I interpreted.
You're allowed to look at that to refresh your recollection.
I don't have a button that's going to shock you up here. It's not that kind of experiment, but I appreciate you flagging if you're going to look at it. Going forward, if you need to look at something to refresh your recollection, just announce that. And if that's a problem for one of the attorneys, they'll let us know. I don't have problems with you going forward.
So the average over the 5 naps was 15.9 minutes, which is nothing that's eye-popping, but when looked at
I'm sorry, the average of what?
how fast it took to fall asleep
Okay,
5 times.
okay.
So 3 of the naps he didn't fall asleep. So those are sort of given 20 minutes is sort of where you're at. So then the question is what happened on the other ones. And he fell asleep on the first nap of the day. So this would have been about an hour and a half after he woke up. And it took him 15 minutes to fall asleep. The one that was sort of stood out as an outlier was the 4th nap. So this would have been about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Siesta time for us. Coffee, tea, he fell asleep in 5 minutes. And what was remarkable about that is not only did he fall asleep in 5 minutes, he fell directly into a dream.
How do you know he fell directly into a dream? How do you know that?
Dreams have very specific characteristics, some of which we already spoke about, and they're defined. One is the loss of muscle tone, usually. Eye movements that are characteristic. We don't move our eyes in another stage of sleep. The brainwave activity that's recorded from the scalp is very characteristic. And the agreement between observers for defining dream sleep versus non-dream sleep in an instance like that is very, very high, over 95%. So this is
So when you say he fell directly into a dream, you're basing,
I'm basing that on a physiological definition of what dream sleep was. He was not awoken and not asked, was he experiencing a dream at the time.
Call that an assist from Mr. Hart.
How are you excited?
is that something you were able to measure objectively, whether he was having a dream?
Yes.
Okay. So I interrupted you. You were saying it was unusual that he fell asleep within 5 minutes and directly into a dream?
Directly into rapid eye movement sleep, we could get into a definition of what a dream is. I mean, does dream mean you have to have dream content to it? I don't want to go there.
Okay, all right. And why is it unusual? Why did you say that was unusual?
Well, we usually associate that with, we don't see it in quote normal controls very often, less than maybe 2% of the population. And if we see it, it's usually the first nap of the day or the second nap, because I think we all have the experience, so you can relate to it. The dream you remember is the 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, because that's when we have most of our dreams. It's very unusual to have it. If you look at the distribution over 24 hours of how the brain modulates when we're going to dream, the time probably least likely for a dream to occur is at 2 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Okay. The fact that Mr. McIver fell asleep within 2 minutes at night and that he fell asleep within 5 minutes on that napping opportunity, just those two facts alone, is that enough for you to diagnose him with narcolepsy or something like that?
No.
Okay, but does it have any kind of significance to you?
It's just, I think people can fall asleep pretty quickly. It's just, I think that's part of what I said we're trying to study and understand better. Clinically, I don't think you would necessarily treat it, but it's always dependent on what the patient's complaining about.
Okay. But it was unusual.
I would say it is.
All right. Do you have an opinion about how long Mr. McIver has had RBD? And I don't mean like a specific number of years, but is it something that he has, do you have an opinion as to
I think we
generally how long
can
it's
say with very good confidence, based on the evaluation and the sleep study from the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville in 2004, that it's at least established since 2004. If you look at the history that's described in that report, it probably goes in, also consistent with what he told me when I took a history, it probably goes back 10, 15 years before that.
And do you have an opinion about whether his RBD has progressed or changed in any way over time?
I was trying to find that information. That's what we were referring to with the detailed aspects of the report. I do not get the sense that it was rapidly progressive.
How about progressive in general?
I don't think I really performed, maybe slowly progressive, but not, 30 some years is a long time. Not unusual. People have reported that in the literature.
Do you have an opinion as to whether, is there a way to quantify somebody's kind of level of having RBD as being like severe or mild or anything like that?
I'm not familiar with it. It may exist in the more recent literature, like severity, frequency. Those are questions I ask about. How many times does it happen a week? Can it happen more than once a night? Those sorts of things. But recall that I said patients, if they're sleeping by themselves or in a different location and don't have memory for the event, they can't really accurately estimate these unless there's somebody telling them about it.
Do you have a copy of your report up there dated March?
I do not, actually.
I'm going to show you a copy of the report dated March 4th, 2018. And could you read this sentence for me?
Rapid diagnosis.
Yes. So just read it, and then let me ask you a question about it. Do you have an opinion about Mr. McIver's diagnosis of RBD whether it is progressive in any way.
Well, I put here likely progressive, I'd have to go,
What does that mean? Why did you write that?
by the history of the events becoming a little more frequent, but very difficult to tell because it's over 30 years.
Okay.
You know, rulers are only so wide.
Okay. Fair enough. All right, so let me, before we switch from talking about RBD, are there any well, you told us that in the polysomnography you put electrodes on his arm, right?
Yes.
Okay, and are there parts of the body that are more likely to move when somebody is acting out their dream if they have RBD?
Subjective testimony.
Do you feel like you've answered that before?
Kinda, sorta.
So could we just get clarification?
Okay, we'll get the other part of the kind of sort of.
I think it's related to potentially to content. It's not been studied extensively. But in terms of the proxy measure in humans, distal flexors,
What are distal flexors?
well, things that you can flex your wrist or
Okay.
flex your,
Are you,
those sort of things. I mean, you wouldn't put electrodes on your thorax,
okay,
on your chest, because you're not, probably because you're not moving those much during the day and they're not highly innervated muscles.
okay,
So if you were trying to pick up REM behavior disorder, you wouldn't want to pick it up from this electrode. You'd want something much more sensitive. Again, the example of the mouse,
okay.
you know, whiskers.
Okay, how about fingers?
I don't think anybody's recorded fingers that I'm aware of.
Okay.
There, one study that we sort of helped direct a little bit, studied I think 11 or 12 different muscle groups and came up with distal flexors in the hand and wrist.
Okay. And is REM behavior disorder treatable?
The symptom of acting out one's dreams is, and then the diagnosis of REM behavior disorder, I guess, to me, sort of relates to what you're treating. If it's just that complaint, there are some medicines that have been studied. In as much as the disorder may be telling us something else about brain function and other things that are ongoing in terms of neurodegenerative conditions, that's sort of another thing you could argue might be what you might want to treat.
Okay. So if somebody has RBD, is there some specific medicine that every person who has RBD, you can prescribe it to them to keep them from acting out their dreams?
There probably, you know, there's very few formal clinical trials of placebo or a sugar pill compared to something else for this disorder. You could imagine that doing it would be kind of difficult given the lack of the behavior happening every night, for example, so you don't have a big sample size. So there are some medicines. There's over-the-counter. Melatonin's been shown to be fairly good at higher doses. There's other medicines called clonazepam, which is sort of like Valium, that has been looked at, but not in a controlled fashion. So there's still a lot of practice of patients or physicians in terms of treatments that are not necessarily scientifically based, but experiential.
Is it possible that someone with RBD could take melatonin and the melatonin not be helpful for them?
Yes.
Okay. And same thing with the clonazepam?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so I would like to ask you to tell the jury about waking up from sleep. And when people wake up from sleep, how do we do it?
Well, waking up, this is something I would caveat we've been, and I've been thinking and working a lot on recently with the patients that sleep too much and can't wake up and experience what's termed sleep drunkenness, which I think some people in the room could probably relate to on occasions. If we get very sleep deprived, we can't get Starbucks fast enough. And it takes the brain a while to work up. I mean, the brain is not just a on-off switch, like a light switch. It's more like a dimmer or a flicker switch. So you just don't have black and white wake and sleep. I mean, that's the nice, perfect world and probably existed when we were young and had healthy brains and did all the right things. And but as we get older and maybe with certain diseases of the nervous system, those sorts of things, don't function. So the field is starting to look at, broadly speaking, sleep and sleep medicine, both from basic science and clinical medicine, that these are not necessarily in many instances mutually exclusive. There's not strict cutoffs between them. And in fact, in the International Classification of Sleep Disorders that I was reading some more while I was sitting out there waiting, they refer to it in the parasomnia section as a commingling of consciousness states is classic for parasomnia. That's in their words,
Okay.
not mine.
Your Honor, I just looked at the clock. I can keep going, but I am transitioning to a different kind of topic now. So if we were going to take a break, this would be a good time to do it.
Is it a good time to break so you all don't experience dream sleep? All right.
Or sleep drunkenness.
Yeah, or whatever it would be. I'm sure we could get it diagnosed. Let's break for lunch then. If we reconvene at 1:15, which is 48 minutes, does that give you all enough time for a lunch break? Any dissenters? Great. Enjoy lunch. Don't talk about the case. No outside research about sleep disorders or anything like that. And we'll see you back in here at 1:15, please.
All rise for the jurors.
All right, you all can be seated. Dr. Rye, we need you back here at 1:15 during the break. Please don't talk with anyone about your testimony. And we'll pick up with the defense's direct examination when you are back. Thank you for your time so far. You can leave. You're welcome to leave stuff here. You can take it with you as long as it's not evidence. Ms. Clark-Palmer, anything we need to talk about before we break?
Yeah, briefly, Your Honor. I wanted to ask Dr. Rye on direct about, what the records said about whether Mr. McIver's bed partner made any complaint about his movements, and I got my hearsay objection. And I was remembering back that the Dean Driscoll, when he testified, and he had in his PowerPoint some excerpts from some emails that were not business records, but were emails that he had read, that he put the content of those emails in his PowerPoint. And so in reflecting on it, I think this is a similar thing that I am trying to do. He said, Dean Driscoll said, part of these emails are what formed my, opinions and analysis in this case.
Were those emails in evidence already?
They were not.
So I guess I'll have to have to state that also, because I had at least 3 heads bob up and down, as in yes, in. Just because you roll your eyes doesn't mean it's not in evidence.
Well, so maybe let me look at that at lunch.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about Dean Driscoll referencing the Arcilla emails that talked about when they were talking about it wasn't even, Mr. McIver wasn't involved. They were emails between Mackenzie Davenport and somebody else talking about, different numbers. It wasn't these emails with Mr. McIver. So I don't believe those emails are in evidence.
Okay, that was the first question. Second question is, did you object when, okay.
I'm so sorry. We had a discussion. I raised an objection before the jury was in the room. It was on the record, and before Mr. Driscoll testified.
To the inclusion of little pieces of the emails?
Yes, in his PowerPoint slides.
Got it. So, Mr. Abate, before you sit down, what you would like to do, when we get Dr. Rye back in here, would be to ask about whether there were notations in any of the records from the Mayo Clinic about injury to sleep partner, things like specific instances, not, all right, let's read this report and that report, but akin to what Mr. Driscoll did. Here's a snippet that was in one of the reports that informed me, and in particular, it referenced the fact that there was sleep partner injury or contact.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Abate, I'll let you sort out over the lunch break whether the Arcilla emails were in the record or not. I'm not recalling that they were, but I can be educated on that. How would this be materially different from what happened in Mr. Driscoll's presentation, the reliance on little snippets here and there of information that he felt was essential to his analysis?
I guess my distinction would be, in my recollection was everything that he referred to was actually admitted into evidence when he referred to it. In this situation, it's not the case. The medical records haven't been entered into evidence, and it's hearsay.
So my thoughts are threefold. One, I'd like to get this right. Two, I'd like to be consistent. I may have made a mistake earlier. It doesn't mean I should repeat the mistake. But three, you guys are going to need to sort out whether it was in evidence or not. The Arcilla emails, not the binder. I'm aware of the binder ones. I don't recall any Arcilla emails being in evidence ever, but in particular not before or during Mr. Driscoll's testimony. But I'm happy to be educated by. I'm sure that's much more. So let's revisit this when we come back. I'll also, when we come back, if we could be back at more like 110, let you know about the motion for directed verdict as to counts 5, 6, and 7. I did receive and I did read Mr. Abate's brief.
It was a group effort.
The state's brief. Was there more?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, we'll see you guys around 110.